Hello everyone, this is a series where I talk about what I've been watching on Netflix, and lately I've been watching Russian propaganda. Trotsky is a TV series made by Channel 1, a state-owned TV station controlled by Vladimir Putin. Oh boy, we're in for a treat, aren't we? There's a lot that can be said about this show, and I actually enjoyed watching it. Personally, I'm a huge fan of historical dramas and films that are high budget. No matter where your historical drama is from, it's always going to have some sort of political bias to it. So for me, it's not so much about learning history through that than to just get interested in the topic. The creator of the show even said in an interview that it's only about 50% accurate. So why was this created? Was it for educational purposes, to show entertainment, or to act as a propaganda machine and supplant a certain historical narrative? Now, to preface this, my knowledge of Trotsky and the October Revolution is very surface level, so for those of you who actually know about this stuff or are Russian, now is the time that you get your pens and pencils out because I'm probably gonna get a lot of things wrong. Leon Trotsky was a Russian revolutionary whom, along with Lenin and the Bolsheviks, helped overthrow Russia's interim government after the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, giving birth to the Soviet Union, a communist state which lasted for almost 70 years until its collapse in 1991. A very brief but unfavorable summary of the October Revolution in 1917 can be given via George Orwell's splendid book Animal Farm. Manor Farm is your everyday farm which is owned by the brutal, drunk, and incompetent farmer Jones. He represents Tsar Nicholas II. One night, old Major, an old pig at the farm, has a dream in which the animals overthrow farmer Jones. He reckons that since the humans, who are the only ones that produce nothing at the farm, should be replaced by the animals, who should seize the means of production and share the profits among themselves. He declares that all men are enemies and that all animals are comrades. Old Major is a combination of socialist philosopher Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, the first leader of the Soviet Union, who died soon after the Soviet Revolution. Two pigs called Snowball and Napoleon take over the movement and come up with the 7 tenets of animalism, which are supposed to distinguish the communist animals from their monarchist or capitalist predecessors. The farmer soon returns, however, to take over the farm, which represents the civil war after the Bolshevik Revolution, where Russian troops loyal to the Tsar, also known as the White Army, tried to put him back in power. However, the animals dispel them, which represents the Red Army led by Trotsky himself. They pay a heavy price, however. In reality, 2 million Russians died in this conflict, along with the 9 million who died from a typhoid outbreak. During the fight, Napoleon finds 9 pups, who he raises and makes loyal to him. This represents the other Bolshevik party members apart from Lenin and Trotsky, who Stalin made loyal to him personally and not the party or the cause. The idealistic Snowball, who represents our boy Leon Trotsky, suggests that the animals build a windmill so that they can produce electricity and have enough food for the winter. Napoleon, who represents Stalin, disagrees and sees Snowball as a threat. Whilst Trotsky was a strong leader and a great speaker and most likely the guy who was supposed to come after Lenin, Stalin was a shrewd politician and made sure that the party was loyal to him. So whilst Trotsky was away fighting the war, he was slowly being pushed out of power, and after the death of Lenin, it became clear to him that his life was in danger, and so he had to flee the country to Mexico. Napoleon uses a pig called Squealer, who represents the Russian state propaganda, to show that Snowball was a traitor and making a mill was Napoleon's idea the whole time. It's a lot like how Stalin altered history after his Great Purge, in which about 1 million people were murdered, including top-ranking Bolsheviks who were even removed from photographs. Animal Farm continues with Napoleon becoming more and more dictatorial, bending and changing every single rule of animalism. He starts to trade with the outside world, hoarding more and more wealth for him and his cronies, until finally the animals are shocked to discover that he's changed the final rule of Animal Farm, with the pigs now being indistinguishable from their former captors. So the book was a critique on the Soviet Revolution in the USSR, and showed how new revolutionary systems can just be an old regime with a new figurehead. After all, like Farmer Jones and Napoleon, was there really a big difference between Tsar Nicholas II and Stalin? Communism, like animalism, was supposed to improve the living conditions of the masses. The big tragedy being that Russia's interim government, which only lasted for a little while after the Tsar abdicated and the October Revolution, wasn't strong enough for democracy to be able to flourish in the country. So anyway, let's look at the life of Leon Trotsky and how it differed from the TV show on Netflix. Lev Davidovich Bronstein was the son of a low-middle-class Jewish farmer. Although his father himself was uneducated, as part of Jewish culture, which emphasizes education, he made sure that all his children were well educated. As a teenager, Bronstein was sent to prison in Siberia for for inciting revolutionary activities. According to the show, in Odessa prison, he organizes a prison protest in which prisoners demand better living conditions. He's invited for a chat and a game of chess by prison warden Nikolai Trotsky. According to Jacobin magazine, the chess scene mirrors that of the transformation of Bruce Wayne into Batman. A young and idealistic Lev Bronstein is told by Nikolai Trotsky that the Russian people will not follow him out of sympathy for his utopian views. Once the revolution happens, he will have to use cruelty to control them. This then leads into showing you how Trotsky used cruelty to fight the Civil War. According to the show, Bronstein changes his name to Trotsky due to the conversation he has with this prison guard and how it affects his perspective on revolution. However, in Isaac Deutscher's 3-part biography of Trotsky, he argues that Trotsky names himself after another jailer and that no significant conversation between Trotsky and the warden of Odessa ever took place. Trotsky, in his own memoirs, attributes his name change to a random lost memory. There might be a few reasons why Bronstein changed his name to Trotsky. The first of which was many Bolsheviks changed their names to strong pseudonyms that sounded good and also helped protect them from the authorities. Another reason may have been was that although Trotsky was an atheist, he did have a Jewish past, and at the time Russia was incredibly anti-Semitic. There are some disturbing scenes in the show stating the horrors of anti-Semitism, although these are mostly attributed to the Bolsheviks. In Tsarist Russia, Jews were outcast from society and not allowed to live outside the Pale of Settlement, an area in modern-day Ukraine. And with the Tsar himself being a fierce anti-Semite, pogroms against Jews were common. And still, Trotsky always claimed the fact that he was a socialist, but never denied the fact that he had a Jewish heritage. For his Jewish heritage, he's constantly attacked on the show, mostly by fellow Bolsheviks, and even today some people believe that Trotsky becoming a revolutionary may have just been a bit of a career move. Under Tsarist rule, there were many restrictions on what profession Jews could and could not do, and this was to mostly stop Jews from accumulating too much power in society. So becoming a revolutionary was a way of quickly rising up the ranks of society. Even though all the anti-Semitism in the show was pretty obvious, I thought it was actually supporting Trotsky in a way, because you could see that despite him being constantly attacked for his Jewishness, Trotsky still manages to be a good leader and motivate the Russian people into revolution. In Paris, Trotsky is bankrolled by Alexander Parvus, a Jewish businessman who is funded by German authorities. Although it is true that a revolutionary called Parvus was actually funded by the German government, who wanted to destabilize Russia by bringing in a revolution, there's no actual evidence to suggest that Parvus via the German government actually ever bankrolled Trotsky. The show puts a high emphasis on Parvus being a stereotypically money-hungry Jew, acting not in favor of the Russian people but for his own benefit. Critics of the show suggest that this is the main conspiracy that Putin wants to put forward, that the Soviet Revolution was funded by so-called foreign agents, that being the Jews and Germany. Putin himself faces threats to his power by political opponents and what he calls foreign influences. He accuses his political opponents such as Alexei Navalny of being agents of foreign powers. Navalny has spent years criticizing Putin for the high amount of corruption in his administration, for which he has suffered long prison sentences and also had a ban on politics. One of Putin's other critics, Boris Nemtsov, who criticized the Putin regime for being authoritarian and undemocratic, was assassinated just steps away from the Kremlin. Just weeks before, he had broadcasted fears that Putin would order for his execution, and sources close to Putin have claimed that Nemtsov was being controlled by the Americans. The implication of the show is that revolutions are rarely well-meaning. They are started by people with bad intentions, they're bloody and ultimately not worth it for the people they are for. This is where Putin's Russia, one which sometimes looks like it's on the cusp of revolution, comes in. The show may be Putin's way of telling people not to rise up against him. Lenin comes into the show looking like he had no control of the situation whatsoever. The entire revolution is done single-handedly by Trotsky, and the massacres of the Civil War are also pinned on him. His killer, Frank Jackson, a Stalinist sympathizer, questions him on bringing the death penalty to Russia. He states that if Trotsky hadn't legalized the death penalty in Russia, Stalin would have never been able to carry out his purges. So he's indirectly blaming Trotsky for the actions of Stalin. The show criticizes Trotsky's cruelty when he was in charge of the Red Army. However, they fail to mention the cruelty of the White Army, which were said to have little to no regard for human life, and ultimately they may have looked to install a far-right fascist government in Russia, one which would be similar to the Third Reich in Germany. In this way, I think Trotsky is measured as a historical figure through our eyes right now, in that at the time, Russia was an extremely cruel and hostile place anyway, and the actions of Trotsky may not have seen as hostile and out of place. Lenin, like the Romanovs, is still somewhat romanticized in Russia. However, the Russian people aren't as aware of Trotsky as they are to the other Bolshevik leaders. This is because Stalin had his name removed after the Great Purges, so pinning a lot of the negative aspects of the October Revolution on Trotsky is a good cop-out for the show because it was in fact Lenin who was leading the revolution. However, Trotsky is also romanticized particularly by communists in the West. During his years in exile, when he was waiting for Stalin to kill him, he wrote The Revolution Betray, in which he attacked Stalinism and showed his opposition to the atrocities in Russia. Trotsky was writing against Hitler and Nazi fascism way before people like Winston Churchill were. However, although a proud moment, this didn't necessarily mean that Trotsky had a straight moral compass. He saw the Soviet Union's annexation of Eastern Europe as justified. In fact, he felt that the Stalinist regime was still better than a capitalist alternative that would have otherwise existed there. His approval of the Stalinist regime only ended because Stalin entered into a pact with Hitler. In a practical sense, both Trotsky and Lenin didn't realize how powerful Stalin will become within the Bolshevik party. Before the revolution, he was an unknown Bolshevik train robber who made his way up the party ranks by shaking the right hands. Eventually, Lenin made him party general secretary of the Communist Party. This was a post that was mostly for administration purposes and didn't really hold much power. However, in a country which would now be a one-party state for decades to come, being the general secretary all of a sudden was a big deal. Before his death, Lenin sends a letter to his committee in which he denounces Stalin and wishes for Trotsky to succeed him. That letter is intercepted by Stalin, who suggests that Trotsky go on a holiday since he's got a lot of stress from work. Whilst Trotsky is away on holiday, Lenin passes away due to bad health, with some people suggesting that he may have been poisoned by Stalin. At the funeral, Stalin is at the front with no Trotsky in sight. This made Stalin look like the main man, and he formed alliances with other big party members, pushing out those that were against him. Trotsky complained about the party bureaucracy and the corrupt system. However, it was a little too late for him to complain that the system they had started was prone to corruption and that Stalin just knew how bureaucracy worked. In the show, Jackson continues to persuade Trotsky that he was just as bad as Stalin. Stalin is portrayed as a beast that Trotsky and to some extent Lenin could have stopped had they been a bit smarter. The character of Jackson is a paradox in many ways. He criticizes Trotsky for his war crimes, meanwhile being a fanboy of Stalin, with Trotsky saying that the murders he committed were justified because they were for a good cause. This may be showing the irrationality or hypocrisy of both these men. So Jackson is loosely based on the Stalinist sympathizer who actually murdered Trotsky. We as the audience are being shown the world of Trotsky through the eyes of Jackson. Jackson sort of serves as your typical Orlando Bloom going into the kingdom of heaven type character, where we're introduced to a new world through the eyes of an outsider. However, this outsider is completely biased as he thinks Stalin is a good man and wants to kill Trotsky. In this way, the audience is kind of pushed into a default position which they may not like. Trotsky was cruel and believed that revolution can only be brought through violence. Similar to Stalin, he subjected people who he believed to be traitors to harsh punishments and even death. The difference, of course, was that Stalin was a paranoid freak, whereas Trotsky murdered out of ideology. There's a famous saying that goes, Lenin may have killed people, but he never killed a fellow communist, whereas that's all Stalin did. In fact, he killed more communists than Hitler did. The question that a lot of people ask is, would things have been better if Trotsky had preceded Lenin instead of Stalin? And the answer is it's complicated. Like most of the Bolshevik leadership, Trotsky recognized that the revolution had to be worldwide for it to succeed. If you talk to many modern communists, they will tell you that the reason that Soviet communism failed was because the rest of the world was capitalist. It recalls scenes of the Berlin Wall where the USSR had to put guards to shoot people from escaping the impoverished communist East Berlin to the affluent capitalist West Berlin. Trotsky particularly wanted communist regimes in both Germany and China. China, like many countries, had its communist revolution, and fearing the rise of the Communist Party of Germany led many voters into the arms of a far-right party called the National Socialists in Germany. In fact, a lot of the history of our past century is based on the battle between communist and right-wing parties across the world. The Bolshevik leadership knew that if the USSR was the only communist nation in the world, it would be vulnerable to attack by the other capitalist nations, who would impose trade sanctions, go to war, and try their best to make sure communism failed. Stalin, although aggressive in pushing for worldwide communist revolution, was not as big of a risk taker as Trotsky was. You have to remember, one of the first things the animals do in Animal Farm after kicking out Farmer Jones is to send out the birds to tell the animals in other farms to start their own revolutions. In the scenario where Trotsky succeeds Lenin instead of Stalin, we would have never seen a pact between Hitler and the USSR. Instead, World War II may have started much earlier with the USSR invading Germany, even before the rise of fascism and the Third Reich. In this scenario, the main enemy of the West would have been the USSR instead of Nazi Germany. After all, Churchill harbored some contempt for Bolshevism along with his opposition to Nazism. And what about the gulags, collective farms, and famines that hit Russia? Like previously mentioned, Trotsky thought it was okay for people to die if they stood against the cause. So most of the things that Stalin did would have still happened, just not to the same standard of cruelty and sadism. And you can tell this by the fact that most communist regimes that popped up across the world were cruel and authoritarian. Whilst I was studying communism and the October Revolution in my high school, I remember that a lot of my classmates were arguing with my history teacher that communism could work in theory if it was implemented properly. It's something that you can see in today's youth who can be quite apathetic towards traditional capitalist values which have brought about a lot of suffering across the world for many people. Our history teacher, Mr. Kearley, who made these mini history raps to get us interested in the subject, here he is rapping about why people followed Lenin.
Give the soldiers peace, give the workers bread. The peasants will get land, is what my April thesis said. All you poor Russians better listen to me. Join my Bolshevik party and I'll set you all free.
Mr. Kearley argued that communism simply didn't work in the real world. As soon as a communist government came to power, most of the intelligent and talented folks wanted to leave the country. Put it simply, a brain surgeon didn't want to get paid the same as a rice farmer. Due to a lack of trade, these countries also lacked the luxuries that capitalist countries provided. So communist countries just became more and more authoritarian to keep people in line, and in many instances just started outright shooting them for trying to flee. The reason capitalism won was because although it had many flaws, it worked in practical terms, whereas communism only worked in theory. The show does give credit to Trotsky, however, for freeing some of the Russian poets and political prisoners critical to Bolshevism, and allowing them to flee the country whilst the rest of the Bolshevik leadership wanted them to be executed. This is perhaps to show that Trotsky was a critical thinker and changed his views on things over time, as indicated by his later writings. The show has many scenes in which the Bolsheviks themselves are anti-Semites. Although this might be accurate, it doesn't really reflect the Bolshevik leadership. Lenin, for instance, hated Jewish pogroms in Tsarist Russia, and the top of his leadership team was surrounded by many Jews. Although Stalin developed anti-Semitism due to his Georgian superstitions and the fact that he felt jealous of a lot of the top Bolshevik leadership. So I had mixed feelings about Trotsky as a person after watching this show. A lot of it is highly fictional, and I think it should purely be viewed for enjoyment. There's a whole scene where Trotsky meets infamous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud and puts him down in front of a crowd. Of course, the real Trotsky never actually met Freud. Trotsky also has a good friend of his murdered simply because he helped Trotsky when he was vulnerable, and therefore Trotsky always felt beneath him. Again, this never actually happened and was probably just put there to make Trotsky seem like a cruel person, even to those who love him. Trotsky clearly still has a lot of fans in the world who saw him as a good orator, writer, and leader of the communist cause. Even the show gives him credit for taking socialism, an ideology that was confined to the cafes of Paris, and made it into the ideology of a government that ran the largest country in the world for several decades. One of his biographers, Robert Service, describes his life as a tragedy, in that if he had picked a better ideology and a better group of people to be around, he could have actually done some good for the world.
We would be compelled to acknowledge, Trotsky wrote, that Stalinism was rooted not in the backwardness of the country, but in the congenital incapacity of the proletariat to become a ruling class. In other words, we were wrong from the get-go.
Yep. Yes.
Then it would be necessary to establish in retrospect that the present USSR was the precursor of a new and universal system of exploitation.
He does actually entertain this thought, only to dismiss it.
Tens of millions dead, and it occurs to Trotsky that it may have been just a mistake.
Such a waste of a talent. This was the most amazingly brilliant man, a writer, a thinker, an active politician, but such a dreadful mistake of a life and a career.